FMC Fast Chat takes you inside the news so you can be in the know in 30 minutes. Hosted by Fair Media Council CEO and Executive Director Jaci Clement, Fast Chat features notables in news, media, and business.
And today we're talking about how we're all connected by being online, but in real life, not so much, and the ramifications of what that means for community and culture. And I'm very pleased that joining me is Paul Mihailidis, a civic media and journalism professor at Emerson College in Boston. So let's give a shout out to Emerson to start out and say good morning, Paul. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jackie. It's great to be here. Pleasure to be with everybody today and this morning.
So let's just start out by telling us a little bit about your work. So what do you consider civic media?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so my background in my work is all at kind of the intersections of media literacy and stronger engagement in civic life. And so this helps us think about all the ways that we can use media and we can utilize media to be more active and engaged in our communities and our society in general. And so civic media is really a term that means all of the ways in which we can use media, the designs, the technologies, the facilitations to support and to be active in a common good, right? And for me, the common good part is important in civic media in terms of advancing our own personal interests, but at the same time, thinking about the way in which media can help support more inclusive, stronger civic society. And so that's where the common good, something in the public space too. How can we use media to help our communities be stronger, to help our neighborhoods be stronger, to help our local and national structures be stronger? And that's where the intersection of civic and media kind of come together.
Okay. And that's really what the premise when we started out on this road we call the internet. That's how it all began, talking about how it would bring us all closer.
Right.
And level the playing field.
Right.
And something happened along the way.
Well, something happened along the way, and there's a lot of different ideas and writings. You're kind of opening the big Pandora's box right off the bat, and I think for me, anytime, if you look kind of historically, and we kind of do this sometimes at Emerson in a few of the classes that I'm engaged with about looking at the early innovations and technologies and what their intentions were, which is what happens when they come to scale, right? And you can talk a lot about, different interventions. I do think these digital technologies have offered a lot. They've offered a lot of groups that would otherwise not have the ability to be connected and support of each other, platforms to do that. But at the same time, as technologies have become more immersive and invasive and, the kind of the motives for those have changed, the internet has taken on, and digital culture at large has taken on a different reality for a lot of how our society functions.
Yeah. So how did you get interested in the concept of civic distance?
Yeah. So this concept, a lot of my kind of work with young people in communities and a lot of my research and practice running global projects that bring young people together and help them think about media and global change, and also being a parent of 3 fairly young children. I don't think that that's scientifically verifiable, but anecdotally, it gives you a real good sense of the ecosystem of young people today. This concept, thinking a lot about media literacies, a lot of times we talk about how we should help teach and bring kind of skills to young people to how to better navigate media. The concept of distance came in at some time in doing this work about thinking of the ways in which seeing civic fracturing on a very local level. We can talk about disinformation and misinformation and our political ecosystem. But for me, it started at a very local level, looking at school communities, looking at the way that our local kind of communities were functioning around local leadership and town issues at my own institution at Emerson, and the type of information flow that was happening. And a lot of where the distance idea came from was seeing the insertion of media as kind of a surrogate for the type of human interactions that people might have to better understand issues and be able to make collective decision making that when social networks replaced that, what you had was a lot of small d disinformation, but also a lot of lack of willingness to engage. And so when we started seeing that, of course, and this is nothing new. I think everyone who will be involved in this today, and yourself and the whole community that you're leading, we see it and we always say, well, social media caused that. Well, what caused it? What are the positives and what are the negatives? And what I saw was really just that we have been inserting slowly distance into the spaces of our lives where human connection would and might be needed to get into the nuance and the messiness of public decision making. And if you'll allow me just to kind of take a minute to talk through how I introduced this concept of distance, because I think the comparison for me is, if it's not exactly rigorous, it's something that I started writing about that I think to me helped enlighten what distance does. And so I compared this concept of civic distance to the concept of being in an automobile and driving and being alone in a car, right? So the comparison was, and this is just more of a provocation than some scientific fact, but the idea that you're surrounded by metal and glass and you're moving in real time and you're forced to make decisions immediately, and a lot of assumptions about the intentions of others in those spaces without being able to engage in them, right? So if you're driving, you're forced to navigate the road. There are some rules in place, right? But a lot of times you're navigating, and in that time you're dealing with a lot of things coming at you at once. Your attention is focused, but it's focused on a lot, so it's distributed. And you're also navigating other humans that you're not really connected with but reliant on, right? So when somebody might cut you off by accident, you don't stop and say, oh, maybe they're in a rush because they have a family emergency, or maybe they're having a really tough day at work, or maybe they've just lost their job. You normally jump to this really negative conclusion, and then it moves. And I've thought about this a lot in terms of the way we've cultivated our digital lives, right? And part of the car, you can talk about all the things the car has done to completely change society. As a society, we've put a lot of strong regulations on what cars can and can't do, right? Because we're protecting physical lives. If you take that comparison into the digital space, you have the same metal and glass that have kind of encapsulated us metaphorically through our digital devices, our iPads and our phones and things that we're connected to. And we're usually having the same type of decision making, which is, a lot of things, our attention is distributed, focused in on this process. We're reliant on others, but in real time while we're having to negotiate. And a lot of times we're not concerned about the kind of the intentions, but simply what the information is doing to us. And it takes us into those spaces where we sometimes have implicit negative reactions. And as a whole, I don't think that necessarily there's an A to B reaction, but as a whole, a lot of research has been done on what more time in cars does to the physical health of humans. And now we have this emerging space of what more time in these spaces is doing to our civic health and also the individual health of humans. And for me, I think if we look at this from a capacity of more time there, it just cultivates slowly distance from those type of what we call the rigors of the human, the rigors of human connection, right? Or the rigors of human interaction. And so that concept of distance, to me, it creates a useful way for us to talk about the implications of digital lives on community without saying, well, it's either good or bad, right? But if it insert distance from what and how can we maybe solve for that?
Okay. I want to go back to something you said earlier on, which is how, we're using social media to connect, find out what's happening in the community, within our schools, whatever. I mean, if we went back before the internet, that would be the way we would traditionally connect, using local news, local media. So, we're living in a time where, depending on who you talk to, local news is either dying or dead. But I think what's interesting is, your audience when you teach college, you're dealing with a group who grew up in the digital age, who doesn't necessarily know what local news is or even where to find it.
Right.
So is it is it a matter of, how do I say this? Are we not educating people to what's available to them out there? Or is it strictly, they want to be in those spaces where you go into that rabbit hole and you negatively react like you've just been cut off in your car?
Right. It's a really good question, it's not an easy one to answer. And I would say this for young people, like the local news, although, optimistically, it's kind of like even thinking about it from local news to local media ecosystems, right? And so what I have, like local news ecosystems, young people are embedded in digital cultures, right? But they're still very interested in what happens around them, right? And they're just using these large tools, right? So I do say optimistically, because at least where I am in the northeast of the country, there is a nice revival of like local news infrastructures with a lot of support. So I want to hold that, but I want to hold it optimistically. For young people, for me, I think even what predates that is that there's a lot of real interest in local ecosystems, and young people are connecting in a lot of really interesting ways in their communities, right? But it's that dependence on those tools. And I think some of that is positive, right? Like as they are maturing and finding their voice and understanding how to engage in their personal and public spaces, those technologies can be useful and helpful, and to an extent. But for me, I think what first matters is that communities prioritize the human element of this, right? And so when I say distance, like the more phones get inserted earlier into the school life, earlier into the life of the individual, I think there's not even an opportunity for them to embed themselves in their local ecosystems and the media, right? Like if there are strong, robust, young people have never really been so disposed to be actively engaged in local news. Communities hurt when there's no local news. We know that for a fact, right? We know that, communities with no local news pay higher taxes. They have less participation by their communities. There's less commitment to helping solve communal problems. We know that when they're relying on technology. So I think I do want to separate kind of the agency of young people versus kind of the health of the community as well. For young people, for me, I mean, this is a whole nother area that we talk about, in terms of the structures that they need to thrive. And, and a lot of, even our Surgeon General is now kind of warning on this about health effects, and not that we have to take everything away, although the new book by a professor down at NYU is kind of saying that under 16, we should not have engagement with our phones and technologies. That's one extreme way to do it. But I do think what I want to call for is a reprioritization of the kind of proximal environment of the human connection. Of you see it when they're out in the community, when they're in the sports field, when they're volunteering and organizing, and continuing to make that a priority before giving them access to technology, so that when they're in those environments, they're not always having to negotiate when to be digitally immersed and when to be physically immersed.
Yeah. And have the social skills to be able to actually talk to someone, correct?
That is a big part of what this is about, is the like almost social skills to be able to engage, the resilience to be able to kind of find ways to engage when it's not easy, to not have to fade away into a mediated device, the ability to kind of be creative when the time allows, like all of these things that we see happening that I think collectively form a strong civic health and a strong awareness of community needs. That when those things are replaced by, a lot of time in mediated spaces, it becomes much harder to see those visualized and see those actualized in our community spaces.
Yeah. And one of the questions I always get really comes from parents saying, I'm not familiar with these technologies. I don't really know what my kid is doing online all that time. I just know they're online a lot.
Yeah.
So are there any guidelines or even warning signs for young children that parents should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the largest, we talk a lot about, talking a lot about the schools and what they can do. The home is where a lot of these habits and disciplines emerge. And I think there's two things to think about here. Mainly, there's a lot, but two mainly. One is like the modeling of the parents in the home, right? So there's not a lot of transparency in our devices, right? There's not a lot of, you
Right.
might be reading an article or reading news or engaged in
Yeah.
some work thing, but to a child,
Right.
all they see is you and your head is in the screen, right? So
Yeah.
so
Like
there's
it.
not a lot of transparency. So the modeling in the home is probably the biggest predictor of the
Okay.
young person's needs. So that's one big thing, is like knowing when to model engagement, reintroducing transparency into our media habits, because young people, like, they want that. It's a very different experience if if I'm behind a computer looking at college basketball scores, and if my son and I have a printed out piece of paper and we can talk about the teams, right? Like, I do feel, I don't want to sound old or like turning back the clock, but being really transparent about what and how and when we engage, that's a really big one. And the second one is, we do know this with the number one thing is, I don't know what they're doing. You don't want to interfere in some sense. You don't want to cause there to be anger. It's hard as a parent because it's very easy. It's hard enough to be a parent and run a household in the first place. It's almost harder if you're going to try to insert yourself into the technological lives. But we know that unregulated access to early technology we know this from 15 years of research around these tools now, is
Mhm.
is strongly correlated to the physical, mental health of young people, right? Like, we have to be creating the boundaries and structures for when and how and what young people can go on. And there's a lot of fear of, like, them being socially left behind, but there's not a lot of benefit to letting a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old onto YouTube unregulated for hours on end. And the regulation is hard because with a TV screen in a public space, you can see what young people are doing and watching. With a computer in a public area, like, a lot of these aren't new, but I do think there is a re-engagement, especially as mobile adoption becomes early and earlier, with setting clear boundaries and structures for when they can be on, for what they can be on. Like, social media, social networks are the worst thing to have young people on. Games, really interactive spaces are great, right? It's a lot of it's more there's more benefit there than there might be to watching TV. So I really think that that's important for families as they think about how to kind of cultivate healthy media ecosystems.
Yeah. And I know some of the warning signs with young children that they've been online too much is they are isolated. They're not talking and have friends the way you would expect a child to have friends. Are there any other key things parents should be looking out for that should make them say, hey, we may have a problem here?
Yep. That's a really good one. There's a lot of social isolation. It's kind of, I don't know if irony is the right way, but like, the more they're connecting in through these networks,
Yeah.
the harder it is for them to facilitate. I think another one is the ability for them to navigate, like, the ability for them to thrive in situations where there's not a lot around them. So people that have more time with technology, when it's just an open opportunity to be bored and to be creative, there's a lot of resistance to that. So kids being able to be self-sufficient without technology is a large predictor, right? And that's a hard one. Kids being able to engage and have meaningful dialogue and curiosity is another one. If they're shutting down without technology, it's a clear sign that they need to rebalance their technological habits, right? If they're not able to kind of find other means to engage, that's a really big one. Obviously, we can get into there's a whole kind of medical angle to this around anxiety and how that's
Right.
related to technology use. That's a really big one. And signs of anxiety, closed off, kind of alone time, just kind of feeling alone, feeling lonely. There's a lot of research now that's cultivated through always feeling a low self-esteem when you're engaged in these networks that are lining it up. So those are some, I think, very clear signs of needing to find to rebalance, to get that health back into a solid space.
Okay. Let's talk about belonging. Is when you talk about a culture of distance, how do you really belong anywhere?
Right. Yeah, thank you. It's a tough one. So I hope, for this community, that idea of distance, like what I really appreciated about our conversation so far, Jaci, is that we're talking about distance in terms of that feeling of being engaged in your community, but also being engaged personally with those around you, with family and friends and neighborhood. And so that's really important for us to think about what this phenomenon of distance might do to us. And it's not distance of feeling like, we have this idea of like, there's been, Sherry Turkle wrote this kind of famous book called Alone Together, 10, 11 years ago. And I think we're seeing kind of some of the normalization of that idea of like distance doesn't mean that we are physically distant. We can be in really communal settings and feel distant because we haven't found ways to mature in that space. And so belonging to me, it came from this question of saying like, if we kind of accept the idea that that we have kind of cultivated this idea of distance, where we're less engaged in our community, where we're less able to find avenues to meet with others. We talk about what does it mean to belong in a culture of distance. And for me, the answer is to reprioritize the human in our digital lives, right? Is to find ways to retrieve a human value, right? To restore what makes us human in the first place, our capacity to care with others, to imagine, to laugh, embrace, to engage in meaningful collective pursuits, to feel connected to environments larger than ourselves. And so to belong means that, and it means to reestablish and reprioritize that which is very human, and then to see our technological and our digital lives to support that, and not the other way around. So as not to immerse ourselves in our digital lives, and then when we need to take a break, we'll go outside, right? But it means to reprioritize that which is human, retrieval for the human values. And I'll just kind of give a small example of some research that we use in this to talk about belonging, is to talk about people's general opinion of people that have differing political views in their immediate communities. Is if you ask them about it or survey them about it, it will be quite polarizing, right? They will often say, I don't want to have any interest engaging with people that vote this way or people that think this way, right? And that is a clear tell sign of being in the digital silo, right? Of I would never talk to or want to engage because it's irrational. Whereas if you talk to people about their engagements in their physical communities, like their neighborhoods, like those places where you see people, they talk about those people as humans, not as political ideologies, right? So our neighbor across the street, they have these political, and they don't even know, oh, they're great, they're wonderful people, they do this, they help us this way. If we need something, if our child needs to be cared for after school, not that, oh, they voted this way or they have this thought on this social topic, right? And so this coming out to me is, and we've done research like this as well, is the most telltale sign that the need to retrieve that human values, to go out and meet people as humans and as parts of communities, and not as representing, very reductionist, large political ideologies. That's kind of the first step in belonging.
Okay. All right. So basically, from what you're saying, we're doing it all wrong because we're going online first.
I mean, in a way, and if we wanted to kind of reduce it to that, I do think it's, we talk a lot, and we can maybe talk about this later, but even in the media literacy movements, and I don't want to take it too far afield, but, we oftentimes start with, here's the media and here's us, and how do we better kind of read and critically consume that? Where, in work that we've been doing the last 3 years has been saying, actually, time out. Like you're again, you're relying on this mediated space, and you're creating distance by saying the media is there and we're here. What we argue first in all media interventions is for us to talk about who we are, what we believe in, what is our social situation, what do we care about, how do we care about that, and why? So what in our personal background, what in our experience matters? And then how does media help us or hurt us in our pursuit to want to care about this? And how can we find others to do really interesting work with, and then use media, right? So I do feel like it's almost an inversion of the way that we've been thinking about, technology and its ability to help us engage. but we need to kind of
Right.
reframe that.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering what impact the pandemic had.
Oh my goodness, that that's a big one.
Yeah.
The pandemic, it's still being, we're still kind of coming
Yeah.
coming very much out of that, but it almost, amongst all the other, the physical and mental toll it took on our societies, it doubled down on the necessity of us to rely on technologies, and I do think we're starting to emerge in different ways. But I do think the pandemic really had an impact on the way in which, I mean, not only learning loss, but that loss in our ability to be actively engaged with others. And there were some, there were some more positive moments about people having more time to do more work in their communities at a distance. But by and large, I think a lot of our work has to be corrective or restorative, right? Like that, restoring the human values, especially
Mhm.
important after the pandemic.
Okay. All right. Um, you talk about concepts like care and agency.
Mhm.
So I want to make sure, like, how do we recenter ourselves when we talk about these things? And maybe it's a little too academic in the approach. So what does it really mean? Like, what should I be doing on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's, yeah, no, I really, I think that, for us on the daily basis has been like, and this isn't, it's, again, I say, like, this doesn't mean you're going to go out there and become the leader of your community, or you're going to become the world's biggest activist and solve the problem, but really being intentional about finding that time. So when we say care, it's finding out what we care about and why, so we care about our schools in the town that I live in, right? And so
Mhm.
before we care about our schools, and you read about them and you might donate $25 to, what does it mean to care? Well, let's go out and join one of the friends groups. Let's go out and join our education fund. Let's go out to the vault, to the events at the school, right? Like, to reprioritize. And when you go out to a local sporting event, for example, we always say we don't have time. And I think part of our digital culture is like, it's theoretically, everyone says we don't have time anymore, but really we've just we've reprioritized to always feel that way, because we're always feeling like we're taxed, because we're always engaged, right? So
Right.
going to a local community play, going to a local sporting event, you meet people, you engage. Like, these are the things that we need to reinvigorate. And again, I don't think this is a retrieval of something that we've lost. I really think it's just about us reprioritizing. If you care about your town and you want to support it, find those things that matter to you and carve out that time to be very present. And through that, what you find, and again, is that people end up feeling happier just being around other people. It's like an anecdote to this idea of like being sucked into the vortex, like going out to an 11 a.m. kind of community event. If it's a band on Sundays, you might sit there and look around, but seeing those other faces smiling and getting into a passive conversation at the beer truck line, all, I think, again, it's not solving, but it's all very positive. So I think that those are the baby steps that we can be doing on a regular basis, right? Is trading off that time where we just be slinking into digital devices and being active and finding ways to expose ourselves to other. And those words, as academic they are, it's, well, we care, and the agency part is like, we can act, we can take time to do this, and it feels a lot of time, but I do think, again and again, it shows that it just elevates it. It's nurturing in a way, right? To
Yeah.
find ways to be more present and active in the community. And it's also good modeling for younger generations, and what type of behaviors are fulfilling for them. Even if it's like, Sunday nights, Sundays out in the neighborhood, right? Like,
Mhm.
make the effort to go be with others.
Okay. Now, I'm wondering though, as you talk, how the algorithms are going to work against me on this concept,
Yeah.
right? Because they're encouraging me to spend more and more time online and go down those little rabbit holes. And, there goes the day, there goes the weekend.
Yep. Yep. I mean, you know, this, like, yeah. And that's number one reason why it's stronger to push back against that. And that's also the reason why it's, as they become more invasive, and as we see emergent AI technologies, finding more ways to ever be present in our lives. Like, we have to balance that. It's there are some that will argue that you can find that same type of nurturement through digital spaces. But at this point, there's nothing that to me believes that being embedded in a device all the time can do the same thing that being out in nature and out in the world can do. And so algorithms, they're very, it's a very kind of slippery slope now, where like our policymakers are trying to figure out how to help with innovation, but also protect people's rights to privacy and people's rights to having their own autonomy in their digital spaces. So to me, as they become more invasive and more present, it's another call for why we need to be very clear about when and how we're online and when and how we're offline. And there are a lot of movements underway for people to, take one day a week and just shut everything off. It's almost like that type, like, as algorithms become more invasive, humans need to be more intentional about, finding ways to just distance ourselves from the technologies that end up running most of our daily lives.
Okay.
There was a great example about this, about a journalist who went back to a flip phone for 1 month, and just tried it as an anecdote to being engaged with the phone all the time, right? And what the outcome was like, it was one of the most refreshing parts of life. Like, when you were out in the world and you were just there, you didn't have something to completely always take your cognitive capacity away. But at the same time, realizing how dependent we have become on these mobile technologies to facilitate parking, bus fare, tickets for things, navigation, like all that. So it to me, it kind of talks to, like, maybe there's enough value in them in our mobile technologies and digital technologies that we're not going to erase them. But it also reminded me of the need to go to that flip phone mentality, on a regular basis, to remind ourselves of all the ways that we can elicit wonder and joy in the world.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you have any personal rules for how you're using technology.
Yeah, we have a lot, and I'm not always perfect with them, but I am married also to a public educator, and I think she sees it quite often in the schools, and it's actually, being in a multiple range of schools over many years, educators are really good at knowing the technological reality of their students. Simply by how they behave and engage in classrooms. It's fairly fascinating. We have a lot of rules in our home around time when we are physically present together, time when technologies are away versus time when we're able to have them. We have very open and transparent rules about what we're allowed to do on technologies and what we're not allowed to do. And we always are prioritizing time as a family where we're not bringing or having those technologies in place. Those, I think, are all very important. I've also realized, like everybody else, like that phone rule of, like, making sure that at night and in the morning you can remove yourself from the dependency on those technologies. It's an hour before you go to bed, an hour after you wake up.
Yeah.
Be clear of devices. It does so much to restore and to bring health. So that a lot. We have done it, but not constant enough about having that day a week where you're just going to be removed. And part of it is, everybody has constraints. And so this isn't like, I want this to be from a lens of equity, and we all have different things that we have to do and places we have to be and rely on those. But really just setting boundaries for ourselves and myself, and finding those times to just keep the technology away. Having print things is important to me. Not that we won't be completely digital soon, but that also is a way to free your mind and not get distracted.
Yeah. I mean, I know people who do things as simple as, no phones at the dinner table. You need to be totally present when you're at dinner. Or, pizza night, Friday night is pizza night, so no phones on Friday night, that sort of thing.
I mean, those are the small things that you start, and then they become part of it becomes part of all the things you do. Like you're playing games, you're watching you're watching college basketball, you have a movie. It's just like even those communal times, just keep the mobile and tablet devices away and find ways to instill that more into life. And I think for young people, the modeling, I'll tell you one anecdote to this, Jaci, which I always find fairly fascinating. For a long time here, I've taught a first year class in discovering communication, kind of a media and society class. And when we do a unit on mobile identity and our mobile lives, we have the students go back always and talk about their early adoption, when they got their first technologies, what the rules were, what they did. And there's a whole range, you can see it creeping down over the years. There's a whole range of reasons and uses. I'd say the only thing that's been fairly consistent in this unit has been when you ask them about, like, how did you feel about your ability to have those technologies and access to those apps? I'd say 90%, without exaggerating, will say, you know what, I'm okay, I made it through it, but I really wish I hadn't had that much exposure at that age, because it really wasn't helpful and healthy to me. They all look back on it not in a positive way. They all look back and said, I got in situations I didn't like. I saw a lot of things I didn't like. It made me feel really insecure. There's not, and maybe maybe they look back on it in a worse way and they're not acknowledging the benefits, but implicitly, none of them are saying, oh yeah, it was amazing, I wish I had it earlier. Or yeah, so to me, again, when they're 18 and they come in here, none of them feel maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 15 feel actually positive about the experience they had at 12 or 11 with technologies.
Oh, that's a very surprising story. I would not have guessed that.
They feel they talk about things like the games they played online or those things are really interesting to them, right? But the minute they got their mobile phones and went online to these networks, it's almost the opposite.
Okay. Yeah. I'm wondering, with your college students, what are you seeing in terms of, and highly unscientific question, so this is totally anecdotal, but what social platforms do you find them engaging in mostly these days?
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine, like, TikTok is a big one. A lot of them are still on Snapchat. There are a lot still on Instagram. Those are the biggest ones. Some of them are on Discord. A lot of them are on Discord, and then they're kind of navigating, the web as they are. They're into, those that are into music have their communities, and those can be positive, right? The ones that are hobby based, when we have them do their media kind of engagement, that the ones that are hobby based, like art groups or, groups that are affinity for certain people that don't have that type of support groups, for marginalized communities, for communities where they have very specific interests or needs. Those are really positive, but they're all the big social networks, they're all there. And it's really just social networks, and then it scatters down into other things.
Okay. Is it too soon to tell how AI is impacting students?
It's emerging. It's probably too soon to have any definitive, but the insights are really fascinating. And I'd say on the positive side, on the AI side, it's I kind of liken this, and this is also not a great comparison, but remember when Wikipedia first came around, and it was like, you should never use Wikipedia in terms of students. And then it became, and then after a long time of saying you should never use it, it became, well, you can start there, but then you have to find it. And so the AI world is fascinating in terms of students, in terms of how they're learning and what they're embracing. There's a lot of resistance to, like, you shouldn't use it because it's not a way. And students are starting there, right there, when they want to find out about a subject. Before it was read, and then it was go to Wikipedia and just start learning generally. And now it's, let me go to AI and have them write something up that'll give me I want 1,000 words on this topic, and that this is where I start my exploration. And I think, in that way, it's going to go that way too. It'll become more part of the process of knowledge accumulation and engagement. That can be abused, just like Wikipedia was abused as, like, using it as the end all be all. And AI has its very limitations, and it's very kind of problematic when it comes to issues of equity and inclusion. But it's starting to take, on the learning level, it's starting to become more present in the way that we talk. It also is leading to really interesting creativity about what students can do and how they can do it, right? There's a lot of really experimental AI technologies where you can create interesting art and you can find out different ways to be expressive, and in really cool corners, it's using that. So it's all still to be negotiated, but like any new, it's like you said with the internet, it was supposed to do all this stuff and it didn't go there. I think AI, we're at that space where there's a lot of big questions and a lot of creative approaches, but also a lot of trepidation with the way that it's going to change the models that we've all become so used to.
Yeah. And I just want to point out how quickly technology changes. And I want to point that out because we're talking about remembering when Wikipedia first started. So I don't want people to think we're each 1,000 years old.
No. Yes. And, technology often evolves far faster than we can respond to it, right? So and that's something good to know, is that once you feel like you've got it down with AI, the next version of AI will upend it. And that's the history of technological advancement for sure.
Yeah, and also it's one of the risks of wanting to be an influencer, from what I understand. So that's a thing now with younger people. Everyone wants to be an influencer, but that can change overnight, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And what an influencer does and how they do it, what an influencer is, it's, there's all this, like, the amount of how challenging it is to be an influencer. And this is part of it, is before you had these celebrities, but you knew you had to go to this place and you had to try to make it there. Right. And now everyone thinks it's done from, you can all do it. Right. So the chances of becoming a gainful influencer are far slimmer than most anything else that we'd have a chance to do. But the perception is that if you just do it hard enough, and a lot of influencers have a lot of support and resources and infrastructure behind them. So, but yeah, that's part of the digital culture. It's having the technologies in your hand to create, and to create effectively. It creates that idea that, we can all do this. And
Okay. I want to actually take our conversation and turn it around from the point of communities and our homes and our schools and what we should be doing to actually be able to create, a really connected culture.
Yeah. So things that we might want to do to kind of help create stronger connections in our culture and strong communities is, and I don't want to claim that any of this is new or novel. When I talked about that care and that agency, I think to reprioritize connection as one of the things. Like, it's almost like when you were saying algorithms and now AI, the more that they become part of our lives, the more time they take away from us being out. So, I mean, I'm not trying to sound too earthy or crunchy. Obviously I study this and I belong to a community and I have a wonderful family and a very positive experience. But I think the connection will start with reinvesting in our local spaces. It's part of the big problem with our technologies is that they've almost distorted the local, which is what matters the most, right? It's almost that all the media and the news and everything, it expands, right? So all the political and the misinformation, it all goes to the national stage, and that has distorted how we think about our own communities. So for me, it's been, reinvesting in that is local and that is in front of us, and that we can reinvest in the democratic values that have made our community so strong in the first place. And that's to be active, that's to be present, and that's to be engaged. And I really think that is the first step, and to think about it with kindness and with support, right? And it's almost that, there was an op-ed in the paper about, solidarity as like an antidote to the technological, is like, find ways to be compassionate with others and to support our communities. And whether that's going to local events, whether that's reinvesting in the time to be present at all your town events and town meetings. It's not glamorous. The trade-offs aren't there, but the more we can do that, the stronger we can start to restore those democratic values. And the more people, like we always say, it's not just how many people are there, it's that people are there, right? And that's the most important thing is not to make the trade-off of sitting at home and watching your schools work through the technology. And we know it's hard to do, but it's reinvesting and also finding ways to be together, like finding ways for neighborhoods to be together, finding ways to be present and active in, if you have young children, in their lives and in their schools and in their activities, right? And community houses and art groups and performance and theater. Those things they bring out the joy in all of us. And I think at whatever level you are, whatever stage you're in, there's always more opportunity. And it's not going to mean you have to shut off the technology, but I do think, all the research shows, and just anecdotally, as we know, even just being present creates, it can fill you up more than it can drag you away. And technology oftentimes, although there's fleeting moments of care and funniness and you share a fun video, in the end of the day, it's depleting. You finish being on technology and it's depleting. And if you go to a community, bake session, or you go support your local Girl Scout troop and you go to the Memorial Day ceremonies, and those things leave you feeling more full. And again, I know there are barriers to this, and there are real strong barriers with lives and schedules and work. But I think that that's the start of how you reinvest in strong culture.
Got it. And we're almost at time. So that just flew. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I just want to check, is there anything we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention?
No, I just appreciate the time. And I do think, of course, there's, it's been a pleasure to be able to talk about this. And the last thing I'd say is I don't want to think about this as like, as much as the utopian vision would be to shut it all off, is simply to rebalance. And that's been really important. Finding easy ways to rebalance. It's not hard to do, but we think about it as rebalancing is really interesting. So it's small choices you can make to slowly recommit to those communities that matter.
Yeah, and that sounds totally doable, right? As opposed to very imposing and intimidating of how do I completely change my life?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yep.
The Fair Media Council is a 501c3 nonprofit organization advocating for quality news and working to create a media-savvy society. For more information about the Fair Media Council and upcoming Fast Chat shows, check out fairmediacouncil.org.